You probably already use compressors and you probably understand how they work. But at some point the question stops being how does compression work? And it becomes why would I reach for a FET compressor over an Optical or a VCA? Each one does something different and each one has its strengths and weaknesses. The goal of this video is to show you how to choose the right compressor for the right job so it stops feeling like a guess. And at the end I'll point you to a few solid free compressors that you can use on different sound sources to get a feel for what each one does well. So let's start with the FET compressor. Let's go with the one everybody knows, the 1176. So FET stands for Field Effect Transistor. I'm not going to get into the electrical theory, but compressor types are generally named after how they're built. The most well-known example of a FET compressor is the 1176, and that sound is still a big reference point today. I usually reach for a FET compressor on loud, explosive sounds, things that spike very quickly and then die away just as fast. A snare drum is a classic example. A kick drum can be another one, and sometimes vocals as well. In terms of how it feels, a FET grabs the sound extremely quickly and ducks the level almost instantly. The release then controls how long the sound feels like it hangs on. With a slower release, a FET can actually hold the body of the sound in that sweet spot for a bit longer. So let's hear this on a snare drum. This is the snare without any compression. Now I'll engage the 1176. Listen to how quickly it grabs the initial hit. If I slow the release down slightly, notice how the body of the snare feels like it lasts a bit longer even though the attack stays tight. That's usually the kind of situation where I'll reach for a FET compressor. So optical compression is different to a FET compressor. The most well-known optical compressor is probably the LA2A. Compared to a FET compressor, an opto doesn't grab the sound as quickly. Because of that, it preserves more of the initial transient and tends to sound smoother and less aggressive. That slower response means it usually isn't the best choice for really fast, punchy sounds like a snare or a kick drum, where you want the compressor to react immediately. Where optical compression really shines is on vocals, acoustic guitars, and bass. It's often described as gluey in the sense that it gently smoothens things out and helps parts sit together naturally in the mix. So let's have a listen on bass and see how that sounds. This is the bass without compression. And now with an optical compressor on it, listen to how the dynamics feel smoother and more controlled, without losing that initial attack. That's the kind of situation where I'll usually reach for an optical compressor. So when we move on to VCA compressors, the main thing that stands out to me is that they tend to be much cleaner and more transparent. Compared to something like a FET or an Opto, a VCA does exactly what you set it to do in a very predictable way, without leaving a really obvious fingerprint on the sound. Because of that transparency, VCA compressors are often used in situations where you want things to work together without sounding compressed. That's why they're so common on instrument buses, drum buses, mix buses, and even in mastering. A really well-known example of this is the SSL bus compressor. This is the kind of compressor I'll often put on a full mix or a drum bus, where the goal isn't to add character, but to help everything move together in a more cohesive way. So let's listen to the full mix without any bus compression. Now I'll engage the SSL bus compressor. Notice how the mix feels a little more glued together. If I bypass it again, you can hear that nothing dramatic changes, but when it's on, the mix just feels a bit more finished. That's usually what I'm looking for when I reach for a VCA compressor. So Vari-Mu compressors, also known as variable mu or tube compressors, tend to sound very smooth, full and musical. The compression is handled by tubes inside the unit, which is a big part of why they feel less aggressive and more forgiving compared to other types of compressors. One of the most famous examples of a Vari-Mu compressor is the Fairchild, and that sound is still a big reference point today. Vari-Mu compressors can work on lots of different sources, including vocals, bass, piano and buses, and they really shine when you want compression that adds weight and smoothness rather than sounding tight or aggressive. They tend to hold the low end together really well while smoothing and tightening the top end, which is why they're often used on buses and in mastering contexts. So let's hear this in context on a drum bus. This is the drum bus without any compression. Now I'll engage the Vari-Mu compressor. Notice how the low end stays solid while the top end feels smoother and more controlled. Nothing jumps out as being heavily compressed, but when it's on, the drums feel thicker and more glued together. That's usually when I'll reach for a Vari-Mu compressor. To finish off, I want to point you towards a few solid free compressors you can actually use to hear the difference we've been talking about for yourself. These aren't the only options out there, they're just good practical places to start. For FET Compression, Analog Obsession's Fetish is a great option. It's based around the classic 1176 sound, and it's perfect for hearing that fast grab and aggressive character on things like drums and vocals. You just need to make an account or give them your email address and you get access to a ton of great free plugins. For optical compression, Universal Audio are currently offering their LA2A plugin for free as a holiday freebie. That's an easy way to get a real classic optical compressor sound without spending anything. If that offer isn't available when you're watching this, plugins like Analog Obsession's LALA or BPB's Dirty LA are also solid free alternatives. For VCA compression, I'd recommend TDR Kotelnikov. It's very clean and transparent, which makes it ideal for bus compression, mixed bus work. I've used it myself and it sounds fantastic. It's very powerful. For Vari-Mu or tube compression, I'd recommend the Klanghelm MJUC Jr. It's more about tone and weight than precision, and it's useful for hearing how tube style compression can smooth the top end and hold the low end together. I'd highly recommend this one. I'll leave links to all of these compressors in the description for this video. So by now you know that compression isn't really about finding the best plugin or memorizing settings. It's about solving a problem. And sometimes the biggest problem is our own ears. Sometimes the best thing to do is to take compression off completely and it sounds better without it. You don't need to memorize model names or ratios. It's more about knowing what's needed in the moment and knowing what you want the compressor to do. If you learned something and you liked this video, hopefully you'll stick around and keep learning with me. I'll see you next time.